With World War II now over, it was time for the Japanese to start producing things again. Things were a bit different in post-war Japan, with American forces occupying the country until 1952, I believe. In any case, several camera makers jumped into the scene, and one of them was Konica, or Konica. This is the first model. Although it was just named Konica, it later became known as the Konica I. And that is when the Konica II and then the Konica III arrived. Like the other Konica rangefinder cameras, there were numerous submodels. I believe there were 5 different models, and each of them have small variations. Often it had to do with markings on the lens and markings on the bottom of the camera. This is a collapsible lens camera. That is, the lens collapses when it's not, or the lens can be collapsed when it's not in use. Doesn't have to be, but it can be. So in this case, to extend the lens, you simply pull out and turn to the right, and you'll see these small arrows telling you what to do. To collapse it, you rotate it in the opposite direction, push forward, and then the lens just falls into place. This does make it easier when you're dropping it into a bag or whatever, but it's not necessary that you always collapse the lens. In fact, it could live its entire life with the lens extended, and that would be fine. I've often heard to it being referred to as a Leica copy, and that in fact is abjectly false. Couldn't be further from the truth. All right, let's take a look at some of the features of this camera. This camera used a very good lens. So this is the Hexar. I'm not exactly sure how many elements are in here. If I figure it out, I'll put it on screen. This was set in a leaf shutter. This camera had a pretty decent range of speeds, running from a top speed of 1/500th down to 1 second plus B. And it had slow speeds as well. With this camera, the shutter release was actually the lever on the side of the shutter. You tension the shutter by pulling this lever, and you release it by pushing down on this little post that it's attached to the side of the shutter. This camera had no self-timer and no double exposure prevention. While we're looking at the front of the camera, let's take a look at a couple other things. One is, this is the flash synchronization. Note that there was no hot shoe, so you would need some type of bracket to fit it with flash. Presumably this was bulb flash, because I believe when this was released, there was no such. The electronic flash had not yet been invented or put onto the market, at least not for consumer use. This small lever focuses the lens, so I guess you could call it a modified tab or lever focusing. You'll see the small distance scale here that is attached to the body. Up on the top of the camera, it's pretty simple. You have the camera maker's name. You have your frame counter, your film advance knob, and your rewind knob. It does pull upward to make it easier for you to rewind the film. Back of the camera is fairly plain. This is a small button you had to press every time you wanted to advance the film. So once you took your photograph, in order to advance the film, you would press this small button, and then you could rotate the film advance knob. It would automatically stop when it reached the correct number of sprocket counts, or however it counted it, or it automatically would stop after the film traveled a certain distance. You couldn't back it up, and you couldn't rotate it further. Back of the camera is very plain. There's no embossing with the camera maker's name or even the model name or anything like that. Let's take a look at the base of the camera. Once again, the base of the camera is very clean. You can see, or maybe possibly not, it says made in occupied Japan. Here is your tripod socket, and it is not in alignment with the center of the lens. This camera isn't overly heavy, so it probably wasn't a problem. This large knob is used to open the back. This is either the open or lock for the back. Here's your rewind button. You might think it's press and release, but in fact you would have to press and keep this depressed the entire time you were rewinding the film. So when you reach the end of a roll of film, what you would do is you would press and hold this rewind button, extend the rewind knob, and then rewind the film. you'll notice that there are two markings on this back. One says C for closed and one says O for open. And so if you want to open the back, you turn the knob in the direction of the arrow. If you want to lock the back, you turn it the opposite direction. We've turned it all the way till it won't go anymore. Give it a little shake and the back opens. I thought this might be a press and release rewind button, but in fact it's not. If you press and release, the sprockets are still very much locked in place. But if you press and hold, now the sprocket wheel or the sprocket spindle turns freely. All right, you can see the back locking mechanism down here. And there's this small post here that actually is part of the back lock. I believe it is. Probably is. All right, so what do we have here? We have film running traditionally from left to right. You have your sprocket spindle, but only the sprocket wheels here, or gears, are visible. And you have your take-up spool. You just have these two thin frame rails. Later cameras often had 4 frame rails. I don't think it really makes a difference as long as the pressure plate does what it's supposed to do, and that is the pressure plate here. So the pressure plate, of course, keeps the film flat against the film rail, so when you take your photograph, your film is as flat as possible, and you'll get a sharp image, hopefully corner to corner, in the center and on the edges. And that always is dependent upon your taking lens being of sufficient quality that it can record a sharp image. One thing you can do, once you open the back, you can simply turn this to your closed position right away, because then when you close the back, it just locks. To manually reset the frame counter, there's these 2 little nubs here. Simply grab one of them. You would turn them counterclockwise to set the frame counter, not clockwise. So it operates as you might expect. It increments upward with each turn of the film advance knob. As I mentioned, this is a rangefinder camera, and you can see the 2 windows. It's a unified rangefinder viewfinder, so there are no separate eyepieces, just a single eyepiece. This has a fairly decent secondary rangefinder window, and as I recall, this uses a series of mirrors. It's been a while since I had one of these cameras open, so I'm not going to swear to it. There are no frame lines in this camera, so a lot of what you're going to be doing is by estimation. When I shoot a viewfinder camera, and that includes all rangefinder cameras, I tend to shoot a bit loose. That is, I don't put my subject right to the edges of the viewfinder because you don't exactly know where the exact edges of your negative are going to lie within the viewfinder. I just make sure that it's sort of a loose composition. You can always crop a photo to remove anything extraneous, but of course you cannot add something that wasn't recorded on film. It's been a few years since I shot this camera, but it was fairly simple to use. I never really forgot that I needed to extend and lock the lens in place. That wasn't really a concern. As far as the placement of the shutter release, it wasn't great and it wasn't terrible. As you know, I've used plenty of cameras with front-mounted shutter releases or with shutter-mounted shutter releases. This one seems to have what I would call hair trigger. That is, it requires very little pressure to release. I think I would almost like it if it had just slightly more resistance. But because it requires so little pressure, it does make it easy to trip the shutter and not introduce any extra movement. So win some, lose some, I guess. This is the second Konica one that I owned. The first one had a 3.5 lens. This one has an f2.8. I believe I sold the first one to a friend of mine. And then, like what often happens, I decided I wanted to own another one, so I went out and purchased this one. And this one, as I mentioned, happened to have the 2.8 lens. It's really just one stop difference, and I don't know that this lens is going to be any better or any worse than the other lens. Sometimes the slightly slower lens will offer better performance or better contrast. I haven't shot this one, so I can't really say one way or the other. This is a coated lens, and you can tell that by the blue reflections that you see in the lens. If you ever see a lens is just pure white reflections, that usually means it's an uncoated lens. This is very likely a single-coated lens. Sometimes in the post-war period, you'll come upon pre-war lenses that have been coated after the fact, but that's not the case here. Now, here's an example of an uncoated lens. And first of all, you can really see a lot of reflections here. And second, there is no detection of a bluish tint to any of the reflections. And I know that this is an uncoated lens because this is what we would call pre-war sonar. The Konica I is fairly comfortable to hold. It has a nice body shape, as you can see. It's a bit of a throwback. It's not an overly complicated camera. In fact, of the three Konica cameras, the 1, 2, and 3, this is the simplest of the three. The 2 is slightly more advanced, and then the 3, in its many submodels, was a much more advanced camera. But this is a good camera. This is a good basic camera for carrying and walking around. It doesn't weigh too much. You'll notice that there are no strap lugs on this body. There was a leather case made for it, and then the case had straps attached to it on either side. But there was no facility to attach any strap. I believe in my original camera, the body covering had chipped off, and so it's not really leather. I think it's more of a synthetic material, and it broke off just sort of like a piece of I don't know, broken plastic, I guess. As a shooter, I thought the 3.5 version of this lens was very sharp. I thought the rendering with black and white film was excellent. I believe I shot maybe 2 rolls of black and white film with it. I was very surprised by the quality of the lens. They had good contrast, good sharpness, and overall, it was a real nice experience. And that, of course, convinced me to go out and buy the other 2 cameras. So now let's take a look and see what the Konica I weighs. This camera is not going to have a tremendous amount of weight. I mean, it's a very solid camera. It's just not going to be overly heavy because it's a very simple camera. The Konica I weighs 1 pound 4.8 ounces or 1 pound 5 ounces. So it's just a tad over 1¼ pounds. Again, not overly heavy. So I happen to have another rangefinder. This isn't really a fair comparison because this rangefinder is a much more complex camera, and it's an interchangeable lens model. Also, this is a slightly later camera, later than the Konica I. Anyway, here's the Canon 2F with its standard 50mm lens, and this one weighs 1 pound 11.6 ounces. And if we want to round up, 1 pound 12 ounces, so roughly 7 ounces more than the Konica. Oh, you know what? Let's put it up against the Brick because the Brick was produced during this time period. So let's see what the Argus C3 weighs. 1 pound 10.8 ounces or 1 pound 11 ounces. So that is 6 ounces heavier than the Konica. Production of this camera looks like it began, or at least it went on sale to the public in 1947, and it continued to be offered through at least 1951 and possibly later. I say at least because I really couldn't find an ending year for production of the Konica I. In fact, even after production ended, it's very likely that it continued to be sold because once production ends doesn't mean that sales of the camera end. So it's very possible that this camera continued to be sold through the early 1950s. My final rating for this camera is 8.8. I think it does everything pretty well what it's asked to. It's not an overly complicated camera. It doesn't contain an astounding number of features, and it is a leaf shutter camera. While I used it, it was very reliable, and I really don't have anything bad to say about it aside from the fact that it is somewhat primitive. Even still, it's a fun camera to use and a very simple camera to use. Obviously, because it has no meter, you're going to have your own light meter. And that wraps up my look at the Konica I, the first of a series of 3 rangefinders, each of which offered many submodels. And all this brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, think about clicking that like button. If you'd like to make a comment, feel free to do so below. I try to take a look at all the comments and respond to them when needed. Or you can send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. You can click on that icon in the lower right corner of the screen for more content about cameras and photography. And I'll see you on the next video.